Did you know that many students in our public schools feel like they don't belong and they drop out for many reasons? At the turn of this century, Hispanics accounted for more than 90% of all immigrant dropouts. Change is inevitable and growth is an option. Students need to be recognized by the assets they bring in order to feel at home in school and learn with ease. I have news for you, listeners. Some students who drop out of high school find their path. There is hope. Welcome to our listeners in the North, South, East, and West. We are Educa K16 podcast, bringing guests like you and me who have found their path. Today, we have a special guest who brings a message to all of those thinking of dropping out. Listen with love because he offers a wealth of knowledge and expertise to cultivate curiosity, provide educational advice, and best practices to move this education conversation forward. Stay in the now with Educa K16. Shout outs to Jose Carlos from Bottles for post-production, to DTO Music for our jingle, and to Arte de Zone for our branding. I quote Dr. Novoa, my co-host. He says in his book, dropping out is sometimes a healthy response to an intolerable situation. Welcome to my co-host, Dr. Abdin Novoa Rios, who is the author of two of the most recent books in the nation about Latinos in education in American history and the critical issues we face in the 21st century. Dr. Novoa, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for being here again. And for our listeners, that may be a powerful and maybe confusing statement in terms of dropping out. But we have found in subsequent research that many of our students have dropped out because they could not tolerate what was taking place in school. It was not a good fit for a variety of reasons. Some of us were even afraid to go to school, given some of our communities and gangland warfare that sometimes occurred. So there are many reasons for dropping out. That has changed considerably, but a number of us who have dropped out in the past have gone back to school, and we now have the pleasure of talking to someone who exactly did that. And it's quite a story. He was not only a dropout, one point, he was also homeless. And subsequent to that, a number of things occurred in his life. He eventually went back to school and wrote about his experiences. He is author of a number of books, fairly biographical. He is also the writer of several plays, and he is now the director of over a dozen movies, some of which have won awards. And so there is life after dropping out. And we thought it would be good to have him share some of that story for us. And so we welcome what I call Carlitos Jimenez. I have known him for some time and can testify to that growth over time. So it's a pleasure to have him here.
If you just tuned in, we are Educa K16 podcast and YouTube channel. Our focus today is geared to those thinking of dropping out of high school and to the educators listening to how they can make a difference. We give a warm welcome to Carlitos or Carlos Jimenez. Wow, you're author of many books, writer of plays, director of a dozen movies. I'm so impressed. And you were homeless. You have overcome so many barriers. Welcome.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you, Abdeen, for having me and for being part of an important dialogue.
Well, and let me begin, Carlito, with a key question. You have been very successful, even a role model to many young people in the barrio. And you started out as a high school dropout, and as I had mentioned earlier, homeless at one time. How on earth is the question? Did you go from there to become the star and the role model that you are today? Basically, what helped you turn your life around? Why did you go back to school? What is it that you can share about that turnaround?
Um, that's a very interesting question. I think that before we could understand why I returned to school, maybe we could talk about just as important why I left to begin with. Um, and so for me, my family moved from Puerto Rico to Chicago when I was 8 years old. I didn't know that I was not born in Puerto Rico. I thought I was born in Puerto Rico. Um, Consequently, I learned at that moment that I was born in Chicago. Um, but my family moved back to the island when I was a toddler, so I had no idea. Um, what I experienced as far as racism and prejudice in Chicago as a young kid, where um, I almost lost my life to some white gangs who wanted to kill us for being Puerto Rican. And I was 8 years old when that happened. And I went to school the next day and see written on the walls, white power Puerto Rican killer. And so at that moment, at being 8 years old, I just kept asking myself, why did my parents bring me to a place where they want to kill me because I'm Puerto Rican? And so I never had the desire to stay in Chicago. At that moment, I just wanted to come back. So when I turned 13 years old, the only thing that was expected out of me, and this is part of the reason for the dropping out, the only thing that was expected out of me from my parents um, was a high school diploma, to be honest with you. And my father was taken out of school in the third grade, so there was no value of education there. My mother was also taken out of school in elementary school. I forgot what grade level she was in, but again, it was because, to work for the family. Same with my father. So that's where they came from. So what they valued was you had to contribute. They didn't care if you were 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old. You had to contribute. When my father left the house and got divorced with my mother, I was 12. My mother told me two things. She said, number one, you're the man of the house now, so you got to pay some bills and you got to contribute. So I've been working a full-time job since I was 12. And then the second thing was, she said, I don't care what you do, but you respect the house, you do everything you do outside of the house. I've never had a curfew. So, and then living in the Chicago inner city, when you bring all of that together, no curfew, I'm in the street all the time. So now I find I'm from a broken home. So now the street becomes my family, all the gang banging, all of that kind of stuff. Then you're introduced to liquor and the drug world. But at the same time, I was an honor student. So it's like all of that is coming into play. And those are two trains on opposite tracks, but they're gonna like eventually just collide, even though, at some point they're gonna collide. And so my desire to come back to Puerto Rico outweighed everything else. And so in eighth grade, when you're supposed to tell your teacher what high school you want to go to so they can send the applications, and I was in a private school at that time. For sixth, seventh, and eighth grade, my mother took me out of public school because she knew that I was hitting the street real hard, and she was trying to protect me from the street. So she put me in a Catholic school, which was predominantly white, thinking that she could spare me from some of that stuff. What she didn't know is that there was white gangbangers, and that's where I learned about drugs, was with the white kids in that school. So here she is trying to get me away from my own people, my own kind, and she just threw me in the lion's den. But those are all stereotypes, right? So I literally, because I was working, I bought a one-way ticket to Puerto Rico, and I told my mother that I was leaving. And when I graduated from eighth grade, I left. And so in Puerto Rico, I was just working. I was working in my grandfather's food truck, and I did that for about half a year and decided to come back to Chicago. But in Chicago, I didn't go to school. I was just hitting the streets and doing what Chicago youth do um, in the street. And so what brought me back into school was the fact that I got tired of doing the hanging out thing and the daytime parties, we used to call them. And I went to one of the teenagers in the block. He was 18 years old. He was a senior at the local high school, and I asked him if he could take me to get enrolled because My mom didn't care if I was in school. She just cared if I brought money into the house. And so I took it upon myself to go back to school because I had that yearning. And that's how I ended up back in high school. I'll leave it there if you guys have questions.
Wow, 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 wow. Listeners, what a story. I mean, this is incredible. Before I ask you my next question, I just want clarification. So, you finished 8th grade, you went back to Puerto Rico on your own, you bought a one-way ticket to Puerto Rico, you were working with your grandfather, and then what made you go back to Chicago?
Because my father is one of 16. So when I went to my grandfather's house, there were 20 people living in the house. I was number 21. And so I slept on the couch. Everybody else had, a room or a bed. Like I have 11 aunts, so like 10 of them at that time, 10 of them were sleeping in one room. And it was like, it looked like an army battalion. Like it was just little cots lined up and they had their own bathroom and everything. But like everybody went to school. And even though my father also lived in the house, like nobody cared to enroll me. I was 13, you know what I mean? And then I turned 14 and I'm still the only one in the house. All the kids, like all my aunts and uncles were teenagers. There was about 7 teenagers in the house. Everybody's in school except me. They just assumed that I was just there to work. And so I just kept working while everybody was in school. And then that got old to me. And I couldn't find any other type of work. And then it didn't occur to anybody to enroll me in school. And then I just said, well, you know what? I'm just going to go back to Chicago because I know how to make money over there.
Right, right, right. So let's move forward then. So then you're in Chicago, you enrolled, and then as you see it, can you give us the insight? Like, then was schooling important to you and how did it help you?
Well, school was very important to me, and I'll tell you why. Um, I know my mother didn't intend this to happen, or my parents, because my father was still around at the time. When they decided to put me in a Catholic school and they took me away from public school, um, the just being honest, the public school education was way like inferior to the schooling that I was getting in the private school. So I had to play catch up. On top of the fact that um, there was a language situation as well because English is my second language. So when I was in public school, when I first enrolled, they had labeled me LD. I didn't have a learning disability. I just didn't know the language. I was an honor student in Puerto Rico. I come to Chicago and then I'm labeled LD, and then they treated me as if I was LD. And because I didn't know the language,
And
um,
just to clarify, LD is learning disabled for those listeners who don't know.
so then I was the bilingual education that they had over there was that throughout the day I didn't know what was going on. I had to rely. I had a cousin in the classroom who was bilingual and a couple of other little kids that were bilingual in my classroom, and I was getting like trying to understand what was happening. Um, and their idea of bilingual education is that a Spanish speaking teacher would come at 1:30. School ended at 2:30. She would come at 1:30 and literally for 45 minutes explain everything that went on for the entire day in 45 minutes. And it was just so I would go home, and at that time I
Wait,
was
I
living
thought you were young. What year was this? Like, are we talking like the 1800s? Like, I don't understand. My goodness,
yeah,
that's
this is terrible. And so at least yeah, so luckily I had one of my aunts was home, and I was living with her, and so she was the one that would help me with the homework because my mother didn't speak English. She didn't know what to do, and my father either. um, so that was my introduction. But then when I went to private school and I played catch up, but I knew enough English to make it. um, when I went to my first 2 years of high school, literally, I'm not even exaggerating this. I went to a public high school. What they were teaching freshman and sophomore year was an exact repeat of my seventh and eighth grade at the private school. I'm not exaggerating that. Now, that hurt me, and I'll tell you how. My first 2 years of high school, I was the number 2 ranked academic student. I was just A's all the way straight down, and it's because it was just a repeat. So I went from a C student in 7th and 8th grade to a straight A student in freshman and sophomore year. Um, and the only reason I didn't have a 4.0 was because since I went to school late, because I had dropped out because I went in late, my gym teacher, I was a super athlete and I got a B. And I was so upset about the B. And it was because of attendance, because I wasn't there the whole semester. And that one B got knocked me off the 4.0. But anyway, I was able to catch up and then do extra work and stuff like that because I was just loving it. And so the downside of that was that it made me a bad student because I didn't have to study. I was acing all the exams, the homework was whatever, and it made me a horrible student. And when I transferred for athletic reasons, not academic reasons, I transferred from Wells to Clemente High School in Chicago. Clemente High School, named after Roberto Clemente, is the mecca for baseball. And I was a baseball player. I have been playing semi-pro baseball since the age of 14. So I transferred to play baseball for Clemente. And when I transferred my junior and senior year, horrendous academically because I had bad study habits. It was just horrible.
Plus, you were behind really a little bit because you were repeating what you had learned in 7th and 8th grade and 9th and 10th grade. So there was sort of a gap there with those 45-minute lessons at the end of the day. I mean, just wow. I'm so surprised that you're who you are today. Amazing. So dive a little bit deeper into your finishing your high school. Like, how did you do it? Like, what happened?
I literally, embarrassingly, because I was coasting, I just had all the bad habits. Um, I graduated with 3 F's and 2 D's on my report card. But because my GPA was so high from my freshman and sophomore year, I still graduated with like a 3.5, 3.6 GPA. So I still was on the honor roll. I graduated top 5% of my class. But that last semester was like not an indicator of who I was or the potential.
Hmm. Wow.
Now,
Amazing.
how I became homeless is because my parents didn't expect me. That was nobody in my family or even generational. Nobody had ever gone to college. Nobody had ever gone to college or graduated. Okay, so I graduated from high school at 17. I was not allowed to accept college scholarships. I had academic scholarships and I had athletic scholarships to play baseball or football. And I had to turn all of them down because my mother said I couldn't go to college because I was working in a factory. From the age of 12, I had been working nonstop and I was just giving my mom all the checks because I was the man of the house, like she put it, right? And so yeah, yeah. So I was working in a factory. I was making ventilators, and I used to cut sheet metal. So I used to come home, and all my fingers are all chopped up, um, and that got old pretty quick. And then I was working at another factory making wallpaper, and it just dawned on me, like when I was 20, I was like, I just want to go back to college. Like I want to go to school. Like I wanted to go to college. I just didn't. I felt like I was wasting time and deteriorating. And so I enrolled without telling my mother. And when I told her that I had enrolled, she saw it as like I wasn't a man no more. Like I didn't want to contribute to the house. And she called the police and said that it was a domestic and she wanted me to get out of the house and she kicked me out like that. And so nothing is coincidence. The 2 police officers that showed up to the house, one of them was one of my childhood friends who I met because of playing semi-pro baseball. I was 14, 15 at the time, and he was 19, 20. He had graduated from Clemente High School, and he got drafted by the Pittsburgh Pirates, and he was playing in the minor leagues, blew out his knee, so he came back home to Chicago and became a cop. So this was his rookie year, and this is the phone call, and he walks into the apartment, and he's like, Carlito, and I'm like, yeah, bro. And then he was like, the call is for you? Like, he was shocked because nobody knew me as, like a troublemaker or anything like that. And I'm like, yeah, my mom is kicking me out of the house. And he's like, why? And I said, because I want to go to college. And he was just stunned. And then the other officer who was, he had gray hair, so he was the guy who was training my friend. And he's like, you know this kid? And he's like, yeah, man. He's like, this is the last person I would think that would get kicked out of their house. And so the guy said, okay.
And like, listen to this. Your mom kicked you out of the house, and I'm sorry, that I'm repeating this, but it's very important because you wanted to go to college to better yourself. I am stunned. I am like in awe of this. I'm so sorry. So what happened? What happened to with the police and all of that? What
That police officer, he was the reason why I transferred to Clemente High School to begin with, because he said, man, bro, you got to transfer because you have amazing talent. Like, you have major league potential. And he goes, at the very minimum, you're going to get college scholarships. So transfer to Clemente. That'll be the best thing to do. So he was the reason why I transferred. And then he's the one that walks into the apartment when the police are called to kick me out of the house. And so he was stunned. And he asked, he asked me if I needed anything, and I'm like, no, I'm good. And I just didn't know where to go. I put all my clothes in a garbage bag, and I just walked outside, and that was that. But eventually, it was that decision that altered my life, because then I walked into a lecture hall at Northeastern Illinois University, and that's where I met Dr. Samuel Betances. And Dr. Betances and his wife, Laura Sauter, Dr. Laura Sauter, they just took me under their wing, and they just saw the potential, and they just put all their love in me, and that's all I needed. And I became the man that I am today.
So, Carlito, that's an incredible track record before you even hit early 20s. What would you say? How would you counsel? What would you advise younger people who have a similar trajectory, or who don't think so highly about school, or who have dropped out of school? What would you tell them they should do in terms of getting their life together, putting themselves together? Um, you've gone through it. You have unique experience. What would you say to them? What is it they should know?
Um, right up front, um, life is about options, right? So, like, I didn't know I had options when I was a kid, and I was a delinquent. Um, the only options. This is also for parents out there that are listening, because let me tell you something. Um, by the age of 10, I was drinking. By the age of 11, I was smoking weed. By the age of 12, I was doing cocaine. And by the age of 13, I was doing what we call wicked sticks. And that's when you're blending different drugs to get even higher than that. By the age of 12, I was a gangbanger. All the way to the age of 14 is when I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. So I'm just putting that up front so that people understand that the young people, like, I know what I'm talking about because I was a street kid. Obviously, you know the end result. So there is hope. But let me tell you something. When I'm coming from a broken home and there's no options in the house and no adult is stepping up, I have no mentor, no role model, no adult, and the only ones that are stepping up are the people in the street. Well, guess what? I'm going to do street things because those are the only options afforded me. It wasn't until I decided to not do the gangbanging thing because I didn't want to be looking over my shoulder every day. And I didn't think I was going to make it to 21. So there was no plan. But I wasn't going to contribute to my death either. So I was trying to stay alive. But how could I focus in school when all I'm thinking is, like, if I cross this street, that's a different gang, and they're gonna think that I'm in the rival gang, and now I gotta run for my life. So I didn't think I was gonna make it to 21. And so if you put it in those terms, that means that at age 10 and a half, that's middle age for a kid in the street. So I didn't think I was gonna make it, to be honest. I've seen my friends die. I've seen kids with bullet holes in their head and they're foaming out the mouth, and I'm like, bro, wake up, wake up. And it was like he's standing right next to me. He got a bullet to the head and I didn't. So I've seen stuff like that. I've walked into spaces where there's an arsenal of pistols and drugs everywhere and scales and stuff. And I'm like, man, I really shouldn't be here right now. But you can't show fear. You just got to have that poker face and hope that you can walk out of that room because you don't want to be a part of that. So I lived all of that experience. And when I spoke with my mother, because I had the question, and my question was, Mom, why did you not like pour anything into me at all? Like you literally ignored me and you just left me on my own, no support whatsoever. And she said that she was more worried about my sister, my younger sister. So she put 100% into my younger sister because I was a boy.
The double standards, right?
I could be in the street and I'm gonna be all right. And then when I started telling her all the things that I'm sharing with you all, she broke down and started crying. She said I had no idea. And that's what Latino parents, I can't speak for any other, but that's what Latino parents do. They protect the girls and the boys run wild, run free, and just are out there on their own. And we're hoping, she's like, well, I knew you knew right from wrong. That's not enough. That's literally, that's worse than basic. That's not even basic. That's worse than basic. That's almost like Neanderthal. And so, how do you let a boy just look at, you know, I don't know what the outcome would be if I would have had positive role models. I don't know what the outcome would be if I had supportive parents. I don't know what the outcome would have been if my parents would have never divorced. What I do know is look at my outcome, look what I became. How far could I have gone if I would have just had an ounce, a drop of support?
I hear you loud and clear, Carlito. And it's interesting that double standard is very, very real in a lot of families. And it's interesting that even today among Latinos, twice as many females go on to college, now inching up to almost three times as many than males. Uh, and we have many more males incarcerated than we have females in our community. And so those are some of the vestiges of what has occurred over time in our community. And you're absolutely right. Males are kind of let off by themselves, and females are the ones that are being protected. But that has long term consequences for all of us. Going back to my other question, my earlier question, what counsel did you hear from the Dr. Batanzas of the world and others in terms of what they shared with you, how they motivated you, in terms of going back and and basically making it? Because you, and I don't know how you got into writing and then directing movies, but that was quite a turnaround. So what is it that you learned in that process? What is it that they shared with you in that process that really hoisted you to continue?
So, excellent question. I have always been a storyteller, and as a Puerto Rican, we do all the oral stuff. So when I moved from Puerto Rico to Chicago, and I was 8 years old, and I was living in my aunt's house, and she had 6 children. She was a single mom, 5 boys, 1 girl. So it was a two-bedroom apartment, and I'm sharing bunk beds with my 5 cousins. So it's three on top, three in the bottom. So we would stay up all night because they wanted to know what Puerto Rico was like. And that was kind of like the beginning of me oral storytelling, because they would ask me so many questions and every night we had a different story. You know what I mean? And so I think that was like the beginning of me just telling stories. And so, and I would make them animated and everything. And then the learning a new language, because I was an excellent student in Puerto Rico and I wanted to learn English as fast as I could, um, I was deep into books. And back then, there was a program called RIF, Reading is Fundamental, Reading is Fun. And so I used to love that because I was like, man, I could get a free book. What? So I would always be, you go to the library and then you get to pick a book. And then there were kids in my class, reading is stupid and blah, blah, blah. I was like, let me get your book. Let me get your book. And then I would walk with them and I say, take that book for me. And then I will come out with a stack of 10 to 20 books every time Riff would come around. And I remember we had a neighbor that was a Filipino family. They were the only Filipinos in the area. And one day we were playing in the alley and they threw away, they must have did a spring cleaning and they threw away a mountain of books. And I literally just dove in there and I made my cousins go with me and carry about 200 books into my house. Then I told my father, who was a carpenter, I said, you need to build me a bookshelf because I need to put these books somewhere. And he did. He actually built me a bookshelf. Um, so I was always diving into reading. The problem was that when you go to school and the teachers call on you to read, I had the real thick Spanish accent. And now kids were making fun of me. So I used to get into a lot of fights in the beginning because if you can't fight with words, you're going to fight with a fist. But I'm going to let them know that they can't disrespect me. I'm not going to allow that. And so the principal, in all his wisdom, he understood because I told him, I said, you know what? Can we have a deal here after a few times of him calling my parents and they have to miss work at the factory? Um, I was getting whooped at home. So I told the principal, I said, look, every time I'm in here, you call my parents, they miss work, and then I get whooped at home. Can we work something out? Because I'm not going to stop fighting if they keep bullying me. And then he said, okay, from now on, if you get in trouble, I'm going to put you in the auditorium. And then he forced me to listen to classical music. There was a span where I was literally without recess for like 2 months. And all I heard was like Rachmaninoff, Tchaikovsky, all the classical stuff. And like then I started to like it after a while because, what can you do? By the time I get to Betances, it was the first time when I went to his class and I wrote my first paper. It was the first time ever. Two things. Number one, I never had a Puerto Rican teacher outside of Puerto Rico. So he was my first. I didn't have one in elementary school, middle school, or high school. So he was my first Puerto Rican teacher. This is college now. So right away I had that connection. And the first day that he introduced himself, by him saying that he was a high school dropout, by him saying that he came from a broken home, by him saying that he's Puerto Rican, by him saying that he's bilingual, he was. I was just checking off all the whole list. I'm like, yo, I can't even believe that I'm here. You know what I mean? I was so elated. And then my first paper, he returns my first paper, which I still have to this day. I have saved all the papers he graded. And he complimented me on my writing. And then he called me into his office and he says, look, kid, you tell great stories and you write very visually. He goes, but your words, they're like elementary. And then I told him my situation and my background, and then he understood. See, I graduated from high school with a fifth grade apprehension level. So I read well because every time the teachers would call me to read, I would cringe because that's when the accent would come out and kids would make fun of me. So I practiced how to read well. So then I spoke well, but I didn't understand what the hell I was reading, but it sounded great. And the problem was I was just blowing through words that I didn't even know. But nobody sat down with me and said, here's a dictionary, here's a thesaurus. So he was the first. It took a college professor to teach me that, something so basic. And when I started to dive into a thesaurus and dictionaries, then I was like expanding the vocabulary. And then man, forget it. It was like,
Carlos, we could do a whole episode on students getting to college and learning how to read and write right there and then because, or maybe write, right? Because they learned to read before, but learning how to write in college is not uncommon. So that's something that we could probably do a whole other episode, right, Dr. Novoa, on
You
that.
bet. You bet.
Wow. It is so hard to hear this, maybe, Carlos, but from my own experiences, I think we are always at the right place, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time, right? But look at you now, a storyteller, a stronger man today, a leading voice with your plays, your books. You are a role model. You are a voice for those going through the struggles that you went through and overcame, living in the streets, living in fear with no guidance, overcoming with words or with a fist, I heard you say, right? And here you are. But parents, pay attention to your children because this is what I hear from today's messaging, right? Pay attention to your children, guide them with love, both the boys and the girls in your home. Please don't give more attention to the girls or the boys. Give them both equal attention. And educators, please see each student with love as an asset. Whatever they bring to the school, hey, that's what they've got. Expands from there. We are Educa K16. We are a call to action to raise awareness about education in our nation as we bring to life the books of Dr. Novoa Rios. He has written through many interviews. We're bringing to life people that have gone through the struggles and have overcome them. Please go and listen to the podcast that you've missed on Spotify or Anchor, or visit our Educa K16 YouTube channel to put faces to names. Stay tuned next week as we continue the conversation on bilingual education. And remember, change is inevitable, but growth is an option. Thank you so much, Carlos Jimenez. Dr. Abdino Rios,
Yeah,
amazing co-host.
let me just say one thing in ending. And I'm not sure, Calito, if you want to mention it, but you're at the stage now where you are reviewing movies, where you are also counseling others who are doing movies. And you have begun something and about to launch something that's quite important in terms of the movie industry through a channel. Don't know if you want to advertise it now and mention it, but you do have that option. And our audience would love to hear what this is about because I think it's fantastic for the summer.
okay, I'll give you the 30-second. So I lived in Hollywood for 3 years, and I quickly learned that, Hollywood is not kind to Latino filmmakers, and then even worse, not kinder to Puerto Rican filmmakers, to make it more specific. Latinos are about 26% of the entire U.S. population, but I think it was Berkeley that did a study, and out of all the roles in front of the camera and behind the camera for the 10-year span, only 4% of those jobs went to Latinos. 4%. We represent 26% of the entire population. So we are underrepresented on television and in movies. And guess what? When a Latino's in the screen, let's be honest, they are your drug dealer, they are your crack addict, they are your thief, they are your rapist. So even when they give us jobs, it's the worst jobs because, hey, we got to get the token Latino in there. You see what I'm saying? So we have to create our own content basically for us, by us, right? So what I've decided to do is I'm launching a television network. It's a streaming channel. It works like Netflix and like Hulu. And I have a contract with Roku, the Apple TV, and Amazon's Fire Stick. It's called Boricua Box. And it's basically in the beginning, our niche is Puerto Rican filmmakers and content That doesn't necessarily mean that all the content is Puerto Rican based. An example of that is one of the movies I made is called Motel 666. Obviously, that's a horror movie. It has nothing to do with Puerto Rico, but because I'm Puerto Rican and I made that movie's on the channel. So um, that channel is going to launch in August. It's going to be a platform for our people because let me tell you, it broke my heart when I was in Hollywood and I go to a restaurant and the waiter is a Puerto Rican guy and I'm like, why are you here? You're Puerto Rican. Why are you in LA if it's not for making movies? He goes, oh yeah, I'm an actor, but I can't get no work, so I have to bust tables and be a waiter because I have to pay my bills. And so our best are leaving the island to go somewhere where they're not going to be given a chance anyway because we don't control that. And so I'm like, why should our best talent leave? Why not stay here on the island and let's make our own Puerto Rican Hollywood, if you will, and then our best that have left can come back home. We got plenty of work for you. Come back home. Let's do it here. We don't need anybody else. I want to also
You
say,
heard it here at Educa K16 podcast and YouTube channel. Carlos Jimenez in August launching his TV network, Boricua Box.
that's in the works. But I want to say two quick things about something that you mentioned. Number one, parents, if you don't love your child, somebody else will. So it's up to you. You decide. Do you want to be in your child's life, or are you going to let some predator or somebody take advantage of your child in the street that's promising the world to them and they're the only ones in their ear? That's number one. Number two, I didn't have a role model. So I had to turn to people who I couldn't touch. And what I mean by that is people like Walter Payton, Michael Jordan. I would look to those people like how did they excel? And then I wanted to mimic that because I had no example at home, I had no example in my circle, I had no example in school or anywhere else. Nowhere in the community did anybody step up. You understand? So if we want our young people to get out of the street and to be successful, we got to be in their face. We got to be in their ear. We got to be in their heart. We got to be in their mind because somebody else is. There's always
Maybe
somebody.
you can start maybe you can start a mentorship program in Puerto Rico.
That's a good idea, but I have my hands in too many things. So I'm throwing it out there to the universe. Somebody please pick that up because I can't run with all the batons, you know?
All right, you heard it here.
I think it's exciting to have you be the first to do a box that would go on Roku. And it's the beginning of something totally new. And so that's exciting for us to advertise here and to talk about it and to share with our public. And I just wanted to make one statement in terms of the numbers of Latinos in the US. We are now inching to about 20% of the population. That is roughly one out of every five US residents is a Latino, including the island of Puerto Rico. But in the school sector, those numbers are much higher. And in the very low sector, under 5 years of age, we are now rapidly increasing to the point of one out of every three. So these numbers are rapidly demographically changing in this country. We are already over more than 16 million uh, in the United States. So, given the numbers that you mentioned, Carlito, and for our audience, know that the Latino population is growing so fast. We need to pay attention to stories and to the learnings that we have from people like you. So, thank you for sharing that. Back to you, Summer.
Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you, Dr. Noboa. Thank you, Carlos Jimenez.
Thank you.
Hello once again. I just wanted to make sure that we had the correct information on Carlito Jimenez as we have recorded. I want to share the fact that he has been an author of over a dozen books, many related to his autobiography, to his background. He has also been the producer of more than half a dozen films. I believe it's now 16, 17 films, two of which have won major awards recently in the Puerto Rico market and in the Latino market in the U.S. In addition to that, he is also, for this year, 2021, the president of the Latino Puerto Rican Film Festival in Chicago, which is currently in process and will be featured even more so during the Puerto Rican Heritage Month. And in addition to all that, and I believe he shared that in our recent interview, is that he is the founder of something called BoriquaBox. And BoriquaBox, so that we fully understand, is a live streaming of Puerto Rican films and Puerto Rican documentaries that would be accessible through the internet, also through different media such as Netflix is, Disney World is, others that are available through Roku TV as an example. And this is to go live at some point by end of this year. We're not exactly sure as to what the timing is of that. But the Boricua box will probably be at the rate of $4.95 per month for viewers. And it's not just films by Puerto Ricans, but it's also films related to Puerto Rican life and or auspiced by Puerto Rican actors or Puerto Rican executive producers and what have you. So it's going to have a very broad stream. And what is important is that it's the first of its kind. It has never been utilized in this country, and so it'll be a first basic attempt to have a special network dedicated to Latino Puerto Rican issues. So I can be broader in my perspective, but it's important for everybody to know that these are several of the accomplishments that he has produced since several decades ago after being a high school dropout. So that is commendable. We are excited about sharing that with you, and that was the reason why we wanted to bring him into our podcast series. Hope you enjoy it, and we'll catch you again very soon. Thank you.